I'm good.
Got our share of that. And we had to change one of the settings from yesterday on here to let people in. Do you want to see if you can share your screen, or if we need to do the co-host?
Yeah.
Yes, you need to do the co-host.
Okay.
So that I can
do that.
We will.
Right.
It didn't save from yesterday, we noticed. Okay. So.
Okay, hopefully you have it now, Buffy.
Yep, I've got it.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
31 people here right now, so I've got about 101. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and people might hop in and out as they need to with schedules today. And I would like to start repeating much of what I said yesterday, because we have different people here than what we had in the meeting last night. And I just really want to welcome all of you to this session. This is one of the College of Arts and Sciences professional development series. And I am indebted to the Growth Change team who have been on the organizing committee for this. I think I'm particularly indebted to Gina Hunter, who had known Dr. Buffie Longimre Avital from a previous conference and recommended her for us. And last night was just exceptional, lots of praise. So we know that your time is precious and our days are very busy. So we're very pleased that you chose to use this time to be here and learn quite a bit more about student success. We're going to ask everyone to have your mic muted, obviously, while Buffie is leading us through discussion. And at the end of today, there will be a survey that will go out, just giving us, ask for your feedback so that we know what else people might like to have in these professional development series. We want to thank the Harold K. Sage Foundation for partial funding for this event, and the Provost Office, particularly the growth funds, and then the College of Arts and Sciences jointly funded this. Buffy, will we be doing Q&A at the end?
There should be time for it, but I also want people to feel free, because this isn't a formal presentation, to be asking questions. It's a workshop. It's meant for us to engage in dialogue. So there'll be times where I'm asking you to just jump right in. And then if there are thoughts or concepts that you want a little bit more explanation on, please absolutely just raise your hand and jump in. I may not see the hand raised, so if someone could just monitor that and just go ahead and interrupt me.
Okay, so we'll ask you to be have your mic muted while we're in general conversation, and then manage your own mic on and off for input as needed. I'd like to kick this over to Gina Hunter now, who will introduce our esteemed guest.
Great, thank you. And I'm really happy to see all of you and to be able to introduce Dr. Buffie Longimre Avital. She is an associate professor of psychology and the director of the Black Lumen Project and Equity Initiative. And she was the previous coordinator of African and African American Studies and interdisciplinary minor, all at Elon University. She has a PhD in applied developmental psychology from New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Her research, which she talked to us just a little tiny bit about last night, focuses on how psychosocial factors and systemic injustices contribute to health inequities that impact racial and sexual minorities. She's the author of numerous research articles and the recipient of several research grants and honors. At Elon, she's held a number of leadership roles. She was a Center for Engaged Learning Scholar from 2018 and 2020, and her CEL blogs focused on how to generate and sustain critically conscious, equitable approaches that support underserved and often invisible students' engagement with high impact educational practices. She gave us a nice overview last night of some of these systemic injustices that increasingly make our educational institutions inequitable to this day. And today she'll talk more about how we can be advocates for change and starting within ourselves. As Diane said, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Longimre Avital last June at a Council for Undergraduate Research conference on centering diversity, equity, and inclusion in undergraduate research and creative activity. Buffy was both the keynote speaker and a workshop and daily reflection facilitator. Her research, her own research is important and insightful, and her framework and guidance on inclusive teaching and mentoring is practical, positive-minded, and powerful. And so I'm very happy that she's with us today, and I'll let her take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I always get it's always a little awkward to have someone introduce you. It's like, I hate writing bios, all of those things. So thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm so excited to be here again with you today. I am going to try to build off a little bit about what, in terms of what I talked about last night, but I do recognize the fact that not everyone was there and might not know all those things that I said. So I'll be mindful of that and try to strike a happy medium. But if there is a moment where you're just feeling a little bit lost, do not sit in this space and be lost. This space is for you and for your knowledge and your opportunity to engage with your colleagues. So please stop me and ask for clarification, and I'm happy to give that. My role here is, I hope, to just be someone who can kind of help serve as a catalyst for, I think, change that is already ongoing and discussions that are already ongoing, to just kind of add a little bit more fuel in some way, and to give you a space that in our busy lives that we don't necessarily always have to really think about why we do the things that we do, how we're approaching things, how we could potentially approach things differently. And this workshop will really reflect around that model that I presented in terms of that notion of critical mentorship, and the fact that when we think about why students are coming to a university and what really kind of creates a difference in experience is the access to a mentor, a really effective mentor. And for me, an effective mentor is one that is critical, that is aware of their own kind of positionality, which we will talk about, as well as the student's positionality. They're seeing the institution and the context that they have to navigate through. And they're also invested in that student, not just to get them to this finish line of college degree, but really to see where they can go in the future, that's their primary focus. We know it takes time and energy and resources. But for me, I think that's the critical component that makes any DEI effort sustainable. It's that really centering that relationship, but we need to have time to think about how we build those relationships well, those relationships that weather those storms that I talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to be working primarily in PowerPoint, but occasionally I'm going to be asking you to either scan a QR code or click on a link, and that will take you to either a Mentimeter site or a Padlet site. And I also have a shareable link for documents that you can have just up for your reference. You don't have to print them out, for when I'm asking you to do some reflection as we're moving through some of these steps. All right. So this is not about me talking the whole time, but again, I want to give us just a quick overview of what I hopefully will be able to get through today. And that is really, one, to identify who we are in this work and how our lived experiences shape our ongoing experiences in higher education. And that's really that identity work, which equals our work on positionality. We have to kind of have a shared understanding of bias and microaggressions. What are these experiences that we ourselves are navigating through, that we may be impacted by, that we may be complicit in, and how does that shape the lived experiences of our students? What does a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity at ISU actually look like? If you see definitions, what is it? There's a definition, and then there's what it is in live action, right? Like there was a Lion King animated, and there was a Lion King live action. Felt a little bit different. We need to take that time to process and think about that and see how our colleagues are thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in action at ISU. What are the strategies that we have available for equitable engagement? And for me, that is pushing you into what I would call the mentorverse. So we'll be going into that mentorverse. My kids are Miles Morales fans, so I maybe stole that from them. And then finally, we need to just kind of leave combating that intention behavior gap. We need to be thinking about what we took away from this moment, this conversation together, and what we can do in the future, in the immediate future. But before all of that, we've got to do a little bit of ice breaking, right? And the first part of this is reflection. And I do this a lot with my students in a lot of my classes, and they enjoy it. And I'm hopeful that you will enjoy it too. You share what you're willing to share, and I'm just going to ask you to put it in the chat. But if a family heirloom, something to be passed down that reflects your family, were a meal, what would it be? In the chat, can you share that meal or dish? And maybe just a few words of kind of why you think this reflects your family and you. So if you cannot tell, those 4 women on the screen are related to me. The woman sitting directly in front of the shrine to Barack Obama is my mother. And then these are my 3 aunts. And just before the pandemic, they were able to come together after years of not being able to be near one another for health reasons and other factors. And my mom was hosting them, and she was tasked with making a meal. And so she immediately went back and made a meal that symbolized their childhood. And even though they grew up in New York, my grandparents are from the South. And so that meal reflected collard greens and chitlins and chicken and something sweet. And I walked in there and I just felt like immediately this was my grandparents' home yet again. And everybody was smiling around that table because it really took them back. But the important thing about that meal too is I recognize how much that connects to our culture as African Americans that have ancestry in the South, and how that has stayed with us over time. So I think meals can be very much a gateway into our understanding of who we are and what we bring, kind of what we would bring to the table. So if you could just take a few minutes and think about that meal, that quintessential meal that reminds you of your family, whether it's now or growing up, what would that meal be?
I think chat has been disabled. And so maybe if Diane can help me figure out where, I haven't had that happen.
Yeah, Gina, and anybody else chime in if you want. I'm in the security and it says allow participants for a chat and it's checked on. So I'm not sure why it's disabled.
Well, in that case, what we
Anybody
can
got
do is, oh, I see someone. Someone got into the chat.
Okay, is that?
I'm sorry. I sent my note directly to Buffy.
Okay. So if you send it to me, then I will look for them.
I think it's fixed.
Is it fixed, Gina? Okay, thank you.
I sent to everyone.
Now
Okay.
they're going to everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Fixed it.
Fantastic.
Sorry.
Well, is it just you and me, Gina, because we're co-hosts though?
Can anybody else see the chats right now?
We have an option.
Okay, we've got some now.
Yep.
Okay, it works.
Okay, good.
All right. So
Thanks,
you
Julie.
had
Yeah.
extra time now to think about this meal as we had. It is Zoom life. There's always a pivot with Zoom life. So we roll with it. Go ahead and put it in. I'm seeing fabulous meals come through here. Please make sure you are not only thinking about your meal, but you're checking out this chat and what your colleagues are bringing in. I've seen a lot of spaghettis. I've seen some cornbread. I've seen fresh fruits and veggies, strawberries. I've seen pickles a couple of times. Oh, polo and salsa. Oh, yum. Someone said I'm getting hungry. Yes. I'm secretly recording all of these things, so when I run out of dishes to cook for my kids, I'll have some advice. Quintessential casserole. I saw casserole. I saw rice pudding. Thanksgiving meal. Love it. So if someone wouldn't mind unmiking, what were you feeling when you kind of revisited all these meals and decided on, oh, that's that meal that reflects either my family now or reflects my family that I grew up with. I will tell you, when I do this, I immediately get a smile on my face. It takes me to a happy place. But other people, what was that reaction, that feeling like for you?
Buffy, I would just chime in, in addition to the smile and joy, nostalgia about how time seemed more connected than the now, as we're much more dispersed across the nation. Just that connection, I guess.
There's beautiful discussion around how food is not only this beautiful narrative, but is really this kind of entry into connection and sustained connection. We like to have meals together, and the laughter that goes with it. It's not necessarily just the food that's on the table, but the people that might be around it, the energy in the air, all of these things. I will tell you, when I do this with my students, I will extend it and ask them to not only tell me their meal, but to then connect that meal to their various aspects of their identity and describing their culture, their experiences, their family. They start to think about who made the meal, what components of it, how long did it take, why did this come about? It's a really interesting conversation starter. And what I also like about it is that I have a lot of students that will sometimes, that are sitting in these classroom spaces, and they're looking around and they're saying to themselves, well, I'm this racial group, or I'm that racial group, and assuming that they all share a similar understanding, a similar cultural background. And then they realize, when people start sharing these meals, that that person that maybe could check off the same box with me is not having the exact same experience that I'm having, that their lived experience, their life has been different in a way. And they're starting to recognize how nuanced identity is. It's a nice kind of, if you're looking for a nice strategy to start students off with in terms of opening up to talk about really the nuance of identity, I find that this one has been really, really effective. I've also done this in organizations where everyone, again, thinks they're sharing a particular identity, and they're always a little bit surprised to see the different meals that people would bring to the table, that bring them joy, that reflect that those family traditions. So, just a little icebreaker. I could have asked us to report, if we were a fruit, what would we be? I've had that icebreaker done for me a couple of times, but I think this one really brings us into that space of thinking about kind of those experiences, those connections that we have that really reflect kind of who we are. And perhaps it's a meal that you haven't thought of in a long time, but it's really interesting that that meal still resonates to you and resonates with you. And that's very much the same thing with identities, as we are kind of accruing more and developing and evolving them as we go. So what do I mean by identity and positionality? For me, identity is ultimately, how are you occupying and taking up space? Who are you in a particular space? or across a series of spaces. I think we need to know this as educators, because one of the main roles we have is creating space in terms of a classroom and engaging and occupying that space. We're trying to share it, but we set the tone by being in that space, and we need to be thinking about who we are in that space and beyond that classroom, in our department, in our divisions or schools, in our fields, in our institutions. There are all these various different spaces we take up and we occupy. How are we engaging in those spaces, and how are we choosing, maybe consciously or unconsciously, to be in that space? So I'm going to ask you to just scan this QR code, and then I'm going to unshare so I can actually get the link for it. And then I want you to complete this prompt. I want you to tell me who you are in the ISU space. So when you think about your campus office, your department, your classroom, who are you in this space? I'm just going to leave this up for a little bit so that people can get the QR code if they want to do it on their phone and not their computer. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the chat.
Buffy, when I go in there, the prompt on the website is different than the one you have up here. Is that okay?
Let me go in. You know what? It's 2 slides. So you might be seeing the second slide. So I'll go and fix that. Okay, that should be the, oh, nope. It'd be great if I could spell correctly. Okay, here we go. And I'm going to stop share for a second here and go in and see what's going on. All right, try it again to see if you're getting the right prompt. If not, we'll fix it. Just try putting in this code right here. There we go. So just a few words, describe who you are in this ISU space. So we're getting some responses here. Connector, observer, hub, educator, researcher, and representative of Black excellence, colleague, educator, researcher, mother, partner, mentor, educator, professor, colleague, mentor, friend, advocate, student, curator of education at university galleries, teacher, friend, mentor, student, professor, advisor, colleague, teacher, scholar, advocate, and leader, Latina, first generation woman, administrator, faculty, keep going, partner, scholar, mentor, professor, facilitator, junior faculty, colleague, teacher, mentor. I love environmental philosopher, continentally trained, ethicist, junior colleague, friendly, contemplative, friend, advisor. Oops. Relationship builder, advocate, facilitator, looking for other roles. I am hiding from other roles, so I champion you who is looking for other roles. Administrator, mentor, leader, minority advocate. What are we noticing from these descriptors that people are giving of themselves? Any takeaways that people are having as they're reading through these responses? What is standing out to you?
Connections.
A lot of connections. Multiple roles. I see that. So no one is just saying I'm this one thing and that's it. Right. And even if you have this one kind of umbrella thing, you are listing all these other kind of elements that go into it. Other things that people are seeing in the responses that have been given by your colleagues. I love this. Very different than the official job description. Absolutely. We read those job descriptions and it tells us all these roles and these things we're going to be doing. And then when we think about who we are in this space and what we are doing, kind of an identity that we have in this space, an active identity that we have, it feels very different than just those job descriptions. It's complicated, potentially counter role objectives, blending of personal and professional, absolutely. When we think about that work-life balance and especially when we're thinking about connections, we're thinking about how these various identities and spaces connect. We see ourselves more like teachers and less as learners, right? There was a lot of I'm a professor, I'm an educator, even I'm a mentor. No one was saying I'm a mentee, or I think I saw one or two people indicating that they said they're seeing themselves as a student in this moment, right? That's a really kind of powerful observation, especially when we think about the fact that mentorship roles that are sustainable or mentorship relationships are usually reciprocal relationships, where in some moments you are operating as the mentor and in other moments you are in a position of learning and you are the mentee. So what happens when you assume that you are the only one that is kind of driving or giving in that relationship, and the other persons involved are just kind of the consumers? I think that's really, really fascinating, right? There are so many components to understanding kind of who we are and how we occupy space. But essentially what we're getting at is our understanding of what our identity is in this space. I'm going to stop this share and go back to the other share. And so when we think about ourselves, right, we often think about it in terms of the titles that we hold, but it's so much more complicated than that. And when we think about our identity and ourselves, we also have to think about the identity and the selves of our students. The reality is, what we know is that identity is so incredibly nuanced and covers so many different areas, right? That when you see that one person, they are occupying so many different kind of spaces and aspects of themselves. So when I was reading through some of the statements that you were making, I was seeing statements that could align with kind of personal identity. So these qualities or attributes that are distinguishing yourself from others. I was also seeing people reflect collective identity, the recognition that you as a person belong to social categories, There was relational identity, so qualities of ourselves in relation to each other. Someone was kind of describing who they are and what you could kind of expect from them in terms of their personality and how it would kind of mesh with somebody else. And we also saw mentions of cultural, ethnic, racial identities. We could also put in their religious identities, as well as gender and sexual identities. There are just so many kind of nuanced levels of identity that we are constantly walking around with, that we can't forget that our identity is this fingerprint that is combining all these aspects of ourselves. But yet there's something about us that we recognize when we walk by any window and see our reflection, when we look in the mirror. What we know about identity, I think, is really critical to stop and think about in terms of understanding how we are engaging and navigating this space with our students. And the first thing is that identity forms over time. So who we are right now is going to likely shift in some ways at another stage in our life. And I think it's really important for us to be reflective of what does this mean for our students, that student that walks into our classroom, that student that shows up to ISU on that first day is not necessarily going to be that same student when they graduate. In fact, we tell you they're not going to be that same student when they graduate, but how they're going to be different is reflective of a lot of the different kind of experiences that they will have to navigate when they're at ISU. You're going to have some students that are going to come in and immediately experience kind of this catalyst, this moment, and it's going to shift the way they're engaging in the space. And you're going to have other students where they're going to occupy a space where they're not as conscious of things changing around them and they're staying a little bit more in the same spot or zone that they were. The same thing can be said for our colleagues. Colleagues come into a space and they're kind of know who they are and that's it. And then you have other colleagues who come into a space and have various interactions and we see change over time there. We know that identities inform how we create meaning and how we attribute value. That's important to know. We might not walk around thinking that all the time, but it's absolutely true. We understand that from the student perspective. We should understand that from our own perspective. Identities, we know, inform our reactions, and they also can create the support for frameworks for resilience and resistance. And from my own research, I certainly know that they're related to health and well-being. And finally, we have to acknowledge that identity is both inherited and socialized. And we have to think about how we are socializing certain identities here at ISU. So just picking on the idea of what is that work-life balance? What are the messages that we receive regarding how we engage that work-life balance, how we can show up in ISU space that we might not receive somewhere else, right? And are those messages helpful or are they not? But yet and still, we're receiving messages that are shaping kind of how we are occupying, how we are navigating, how we are forming an identity in this space. All of this kind of brings us to what Hurtado and colleagues call the diverse learning environment. And I think we think about our engagement with the academic space, whether it's our classroom or our office, as kind of, this is our domain, this is where we are. When our students are in this room, we give them the syllabus, right? And we say, here are the expectations. Maybe we sit down and collectively come up with these expectations. And do we ever stop to think about what's happening with that student once they leave our classroom? Do we ever stop to think about what's happening in terms of departmental politics that's influencing how we are in that department, or office politics are influencing how we're engaging with a colleague in another space? And Hurtado and colleagues say we need to start doing that. We need to start doing that more because we need to be reflective of the fact that we're in these diverse learning environments, which means We have to be considerate of the fact that our institution is within a socio-historical context, and we have to think about how this institution kind of came about. We need to be thinking about just general like educational policies and practices of the time and how that's influencing the ways in which we are navigating our space in higher education, the immediate institutional context, as well as that the overall kind of climate for diversity. And then it starts to get down into the ways in which we ourselves are now kind of a context for our students, and our students are context for us. And when you think about all of them together in a classroom, how is that context shaping us, or all of them together in navigating a particular division, a residence hall, all of the ways in which we are interacting with people. So it is incredibly important when we're thinking about kind of the nuance or really understanding and designing systems for change at in higher education, that we think about all the various different levels that are involved and are impacting these decisions, these desires that we have, and whether or not something is going to really be feasible or sustainable, and how it might influence the ways in which we are prioritizing or not prioritizing something, right? So here we are as these individuals with all of these various different elements of identity or aspect of identity, and then we are occupying this space that has all of these multiple layers as well, and then we're engaging with other individuals that are occupying that space with all of their layers of identity, and they're having their interaction, and it's a beautiful, messy experience, but it's one we need to consider when we're thinking about kind of how we are kind of engaging and coming into space. So with that said, let's lean in a little bit more into being intentional around thinking about how we are navigating our identities. What are the identities that we are bringing with us? What are the identities that perhaps we lead with? What are the identities that we have that we don't lead with, but still are very much influential in the ways we are understanding how we can navigate, how we can advocate, how we can show up in spaces. I will start us off by just telling a little bit of a story. It's not my story, but I heard this story, and it was just a fantastic example around the idea of the nuances of in the ways that identities kind of interact. But Dr. Claude Steele, who I believe may be a provost now, but is of Steele and Aronson in the stereotype threat research that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but the idea that even if you don't endorse or believe in a stereotype, if there is a stereotype associated with your identity and you are put into a situation where you could potentially confirm that stereotype, it impacts the ways in which you navigate that action. So they see this particularly on SAT performance and standardized testing. Students who African-American students they saw who were kind of somewhat aware of the fact that there were stereotypes around expected performance and knowledge when it comes to verbal and math skills. The minute they indicated their race, their performance on the standardized tests significantly dropped in comparison to their white peers. When you didn't ask them to put down their demographics, they did not have the same response because it was about that priming of that identity. So he is one of the leaders in that research. Well, he tells a story of when he was on a plane ride to Utah, I guess, to give a talk. And he said halfway through the plane ride, he just kind of stretched and looked around again. And he said he had this moment where he said, oh my God, I am the only Black person on this plane. Like, what is going on? I'm the only Black person on this plane. And so he was sitting there a little comfortable. And then he said he kind of looked around again and he caught a woman looking around with the same look on her face. And he realized because he started looking around kind of in the same way she was looking around, he said, I bet she's saying to herself, oh my God, I'm the only woman on this plane, right? And it's this really powerful moment where he recognized that there was one identity that he was leading with, right? And he's recognizing kind of this minority position from this identity. And then when he took a step back, he realized, oh, but I also occupy this other identity that this other person is that puts this other person in a minoritized position. And I think it's just really fascinating when we're thinking about engaging each other, that we are very aware of our different identities and how those identities are kind of coming together to inform the space that we are occupying. So in a second, I'm going to give you a link to a social identity wheel that was created from the University of Michigan. And I'm going to ask you to take the next 5 minutes to just kind of look at the social identity wheel. It's a PDF, so you probably can't type into it, but to just indicate your various different identities along this wheel. So this is not exhaustive lists by any means. They just kind of hit some major kind of socio-demographic identities. But again, when we are thinking about how other identities are influencing how others' identities are influencing the ways in which they are navigating and gaining access to higher education, do we ever take the time to sit down and think about our own identities, either how those identities are also impacted by that access or lack of access, or how those identities perhaps could be considered complicit in others' lack of access? I think we need to be thinking about all the identities that we are bringing with us, these social constructed identities that we are bringing with us into this space. So I'm going to stop share again, and I'm going to put this in the chat for you. I learned how to work with Google Drives for this, so hopefully it will work. All right, so hopefully you will all be able to access that. And if someone can give me a thumbs up if they can click on it, yes, yay! I hate Google, but I was trying. All right, and I'm gonna go back to this initial screen, bring it up, and I want you to take again the next 5 minutes. Don't overthink it, but complete this prompt when we think about these various different identities that we show up into this space with. And these, again, are social identities. So these are identities that are based on our physical, social, mental characteristics. And sometimes these identities are very obvious and clear, and sometimes they're not as obvious. And they can be unclear or self-claimed or ascribed by others, right? But just again, quickly, as you're moving through, you may not be able to complete it all, but we're going to take 5 minutes to do this. And then I'm going to put another link into the chat, or you can scan that QR code and it's going to take you to a Padlet. And you're going to be asked to reflect on 2 prompts that are there. 1, what are the identities that you think about most often? And 2, what are the identities that you think have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? And sometimes those align and sometimes those don't. And it's important to just sit and think about the distinction between those 2. have just about 2 minutes. So if you haven't started to answer your prompts, then please do that. I'm going to go ahead and take this screen down and pull up the Padlet screen. On the Padlet, you should see where the column gives you where you can put your responses, and then you'll see a little plus button, and you just kind of click on that and you can immediately start typing in. You'll probably see movement because other people are typing in as well. Right, so you only need to respond to the first 2 columns there. What identities do you think about most often, and which identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? All right, so my little timer went off. So in terms of identities that people think about most often, there were several I see right off the bat: race, gender, ethnicity, disability, class, religion, education, gender, age, social class, again, so sexuality, first language, national origin, mostly race, age, gender, gender expression, socioeconomic status. Age. So we saw that when we think about those identities that we think about very often, I mean, these are the identities that are, are very visible, right? We tend to think about the identities that are very, very visible, but we also think about those identities that lead to some form of kind of, I would say, vulnerability, right? Or more susceptible, vulnerability in terms of more susceptible for discrimination or lack of access, right? Those are those identities that we think about the most, those identities that we kind of hold, or those identities, we're starting to think about those identities in terms of the idea that they may be their points of privilege. And now we are more willing to think about those identities and how we occupy kind of positions of privilege with those identities. When you then shift to which identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you, okay, we see the same. We see, interesting, professional status. That was one we hadn't seen before. We saw national origin, first language came up. And status, again, well educated, type A. Ethnicity, gender, body size, race, age. Gender, race, social class. It's always interesting to see how the identities you think the most of, if they align with the identities that you perceive have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. And it can be, I think we sometimes assume it in the role of, from the perspective of like privilege, where, maybe I'm thinking about one identity and I don't have to think about this other identity. And yet that identity is the one that others are thinking about in terms of myself, because that's a point of privilege for me. So in that story of Claude Steele, he's not thinking about his gender, he's thinking about his race, he's not thinking about his gender, because he's occupying a gender that has power. Even though we know now we can't think about identities in isolation, we have to think about him as a Black man and how he's occupying that space, and what would that mean for him as a Black woman, or a white man or a white woman occupying that space. I use myself, for example, I think especially now because I have a child who's navigating a bar mitzvah, I think a lot about my identity as a Jewish woman, and being a religious minority, and what does that mean for just, they're like, I got down here in the South and it looked like everything just had bacon in it. And to the point where it seems so small, but like, you know, when you keep kosher, you're not eating bacon, and realize people don't even mention to you that that's an ingredient, because they just kind of assume everybody can eat bacon. It's like, you know, the other vegetable in the South, at least in North Carolina here. And so I thought a lot about my Jewish identity, because I had to always be kind of hyper vigilant in preparing myself for various different encounters. Was I going to disclose? Was I not going to disclose? What was I going to be able to eat? Were certain comments going to be made? But when others would see me, because of assumptions around who is Jewish and who's not, that's not necessarily the identity that others would perceive had the greatest, that others would perceive the most about me, right? They wouldn't even assume that that was a factor. They would be thinking about my race, my gender, other kind of other things that I present as, and not that identity. So it was a very interesting point of reflection for me, and thinking about my space and what I can do with it, when I consider the fact that an identity I think about most often is an identity that, for the most part, is an invisible one to most people. And what does that mean in terms of how I wield that identity? I want to just open it up, because I've been talking too much. When you're going through this and you're filling out the social identity wheel, and you're thinking about these identities, you're thinking about how other people perceive you, what was this process like? What questions did it leave you with? What did you like? What did you wonder? What's your kind of what if in this moment, having filled out this wheel, and through this conversation so far, as we've kind of just jumped in talking about identity? Or looking at the responses of your colleagues here.
I'll jump in. I really enjoyed this exercise, and it made me reflect back and ponder on how identity changes over time, and how it sometimes puts you in conflict. So I grew up in a very poor household with parents who have 8th grade educations. And so I have a different lifestyle now. I have more means available to me now. But yet so I personally might have a slightly different identity, but yet that's still a very real part of me. But I wouldn't necessarily put myself in that same category. And so this idea of where my identity began, how did it get here? And how do I still be respectful and pay homage to where that identity started in relationship to that?
Yeah, that's thank you for that. That is so incredibly powerful, because I think social class identity, right, is that one of those identities that absolutely possibly can change over time. In fact, that's the whole kind of, in some ways, motivation or selling point around higher education. You come, you get a college degree, and automatically you are now supposedly in this other socioeconomic status group, if we are factoring education. Now, we don't tell our students that your income might not necessarily change with the degree, but your education level puts you in another socioeconomic position. And it's making me think about those conversations and ways in which we signal to me, perhaps a student who is sitting amongst their peers and recognizes that they're in this process of leaving this other socioeconomic kind of position behind, but they're not their peers either. And what does that struggle, what does that experience look like, feel like when they're navigating that space? And how do they identify that there are other people in the community that could mentor them through this process, right? Because we don't walk around with a sign that says, hey, I was here and now I'm here. No one's walking around with a SIM card, indicating all of those things. So it's a very impactful identity that is very invisible in many ways. And it's also one that has a potential to drastically change, and see that difference, even that change within kind of family unit. You don't necessarily change with your family. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think that's an identity that's really important to think about. Other reflections that people have, reactions to doing this, just taking the time, or reactions to looking at what your colleagues are sharing in terms of those identities that they're thinking about the most, and the identities that they believe others are thinking or associating them the most with.
I noticed, Buffy, that what I identified as the identities I'm most connected to do not match with what I think the outside world perceives. So there's a disconnect or a difference there.
Yeah. So the question is, if there is a potential disconnect difference for you, and here we are as adults kind of in a little bit more of an established space in terms of identity, even though we know our identities are still going to develop, let's think about what that means for our students that are in the absolute throes of identity development. And what does that mean when we are feeling and hyper vigilant about one or two identities, but those identities are not necessarily matching up to the ways that other people are perceiving us? What is that? What is the kind of weight and the psychosocial weight of that experience look like? And how could you possibly find someone to help you navigate through that process? Are there opportunities on campus that create that space to have these discussions, to open up and engage in this vulnerable way? And that's a tall task. And I'm not saying Elon does it, but it's one that it's a question I bring around and ask, like, can it be done? Since we know it's so critical. Thank you for reflecting.
Buffy, I wanted to share a kind of a win that just happened. My wife came home and told me this story. She said that at where she works at is a small community college here in Champaign, Illinois, and they require people to check in, and they've used an app in terms of your COVID status, right? And so there was an older African-American woman working in that role, and a white couple was coming in and basically didn't like that they were being forced to kind of check in with her and begin to kind of berate her. And a young African-American man who was a student at that college came and basically said, hey, you can't talk to her like that. And the guy picks up the phone and says, well, I'm going to call public safety and tell them a Black man is threatening us. Right. So he walks off and he goes and he's headed to my wife's office anyway. She works in accessibility services. And he goes into the office, and she said he just collapsed on the floor and started bawling, crying, right? And she said that her and all of her colleagues began to be concerned about his well-being. And what was beautiful about that story was my wife is the only African-American in that office, right? So everyone came to his defense, and public safety came to her office. And they all was like, you're not talking to him. He's busy. And they kind of defended him. But as I was doing this exercise, I thought his status at that college is, you know, I'm a student, I'm kind of important with that status, and yet immediately it can be revoked, right? And so he's debilitated to the point where he's, you know, she said he's probably like 6'5", close to 300 pounds on the ground, just crying his eyes out. And he got built back up because people of different races and ethnicities who were working at the college came to his defense. And she said after they told public safety to leave, they called 30 minutes later to get his name. And the supervisor of that office said, you are not getting his name, you know, and they also called the instructor because he was there to take a proctored exam to say, if his exam looks like he didn't study at all, he had came into this office traumatized. And so to me, I'm thinking the importance of everyone pulling together, not just for in this moment, but even long-term in terms of the results of his exam. And I just couldn't help but think about identities I think about and how others perceive you. You know, here's this big guy. And then when a phone call is made, how the people on the other end of that who have authority, et cetera, are perceiving not only the value of the caller, but devaluing the person who the call is made about, and how those interactions, and this was folks who were coming to just get some information, and they were valued over a student who was actually paying tuition and fees, et cetera. So just a lot of interplay that I'm thinking about going through this exercise.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I don't actually think we need to continue on. I think Nathan just kind of summed it up. I mean, in the sense of, I mean, there's so many layers there, and it's resonating so much with like the journeys that I'm sure many of us have had. I like to refer to those moments as the microaggressive slap, like the whiplash. It's microaggressive whiplash, where you are seeing yourself in one identity, but others are perceiving you in another identity, and it's an identity that they can kind of use to maintain power and take you from that power. And I think that's what you've described is exactly why I have us take a moment and think about that, to think about the ways in which we navigate space, that there are some of us that at any point in time, because of identities that we hold, we are vulnerable to someone using their own identity as a weapon against us. Right? I'm thinking about, your story makes me think about a good friend of mine who had an internship at an accounting firm. Like, it wasn't like a Goldman Sachs, but similar to that. And so he's super excited. He's, you know, I mean, we dub him and his wife like the Beyonce and Jay-Z of our class, because they had the majors that led them to these like massively lucrative careers. But he was on his path there, and he was in an elevator going up to his internship, thinking about, you know, here I am, a student from elite university with this elite internship. And by say Jay-Z, you shouldn't, that is a prompt to say that he is an African-American man. And as he got on the elevator, a woman grabbed her purse. And he, you know, and he was like, I don't want your purse. You know, that's not what I was thinking at this moment. And like, you know, to have this moment of complete joy where he was getting ready to go off into this adventure, he's assuming this identity as, you know, this finance person, and shifting from college student into the real world and all the status that identity is bringing. And then in one moment, a purse grab takes him, you know, just took him out of that moment. It wasn't enough to steal the entire moment, but it robbed him of just being in this place of complete joy. And that is something that we think about, that identity of student. And what does that mean? It usually means some type of status, but for some individuals, that identity of student is not as resistant to kind of microaggressive attacks as other students navigate that space. And I think we need to be mindful of that, right? Or even everybody showing up in our class is a student, but yet we probably have certain perspectives and expectations or assumptions around some of the students based on these other identities that they hold. Thank you for sharing all of that. It takes me to places, and I think it's important that we really understand how people are forced to navigate this world, and the importance of people really becoming shields, of using their identity to shield someone else who's being robbed of being seen as their complete selves in a moment as well. I think that was a really, really powerful example. Right. And so I'm going to bring us back, and I'm going to bring us back in because I think that is a really powerful segue into why I'm having you do all of this. And that's the idea of positionality statements. So some of us who are in qualitative research probably know a lot about positionality statements, because when you're doing qualitative research, we understand that you yourself, your framework, your understanding, your experiences becomes essentially a tool of research, right? You are no longer plugging the numbers into SPSS or SAS or whatever, and it's doing it for you. You are doing this yourself. And so we need to understand, if we have to disclose the instruments we use to calculate kind of outcomes, well, we have to describe ourselves because we are part of that instrument. The other interesting thing about looking at positionality is I think about how, as educators, we are a textbook, right? There's the textbook and the readings that we're giving our students in classes, but the ways in which we are presenting the information, the way in which we are engaging with that information, that is another tool of learning and distribution of information. And so we have to be mindful of how we are navigating as this textbook. So when we think about a positionality statement, a lot of times people think about it as like this confessional that you start from the beginning and you give everything. I'm a child of the 80s. So I am throwing in a little bit from the Goonies, from that one moment where they say, "Tell us everything." You know, instead of just telling them what they want to know, he starts with every bad thing that he's ever did in life. And so that's not a positionality statement. It's not this confessional. Instead, a positionality statement or a positionality is this recognition of the social political context that creates your identity in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability status, just to name a few. And it's really an opportunity to critically reflect on the privilege that position carries or the lack thereof it. It also describes how your identity may influence and potentially bias your understandings of or outlook of the world. So how you're seeing a situation may be different how somebody else is seeing that situation as a function of the positionality that you hold, in a sense, what you have kind of to lose. So in that same kind of Google document that I shared with you that had you going through the social identity wheel, you'll see that there is a worksheet for you to do at another time. But to just help you think about how we kind of create these positionality statements, once we go from kind of really being aware and critically reflecting on our identities, how do we move to kind of putting in this positionality statement? I will say that our department decided to use positionality statements as in addition or instead of our general bio. So when we go on and you look at faculty pages and you're given a description about where this person went to college and the specific degree and their areas of interest, we decided to add in positionality statements because we thought this could be an opportunity to signal to students that here's an entry point for a relationship. Here's an entry point for someone who may share a similar background, or here's an opportunity for you to see that this person is very much aware of how they're occupying space. And so where they might not understand completely how you're occupying space, they do recognize that identities shape the way we engage in the world and the way we experience kind of the higher education campus domain. So I just throw that out there because if you say, well, I'm not doing qualitative research, why do I need to consider this? I think anytime we do a bio, we could consider kind of what a bio that's infused with a positionality statement might look like. So how do we go about framing that? We start with the idea, we start with a few prompts. We start asking ourselves, you know, how does your personal, professional, or intellectual positionalities, and these could be identities, contexts, experiences, and perspectives, cohere with or diverge from your teaching and your research, right? So how is it who you are is influencing who you are as an educator in this space? What are the legacies, personal, communal, societal, national, transnational, and that inform the social constructedness of your positionality? So again, what brings you here? In what ways or not are you consciously or not reifying, resisting, disrupting, and or changing the constructs of your positionality through your teaching and your roles? So how are you actively engaging your positionality? How has it changed over time? This goes back to, I think, a statement that Joan made about where her experiences were growing up and then where she is now. And then finally, excuse me, how is your positionality recognizing, honoring, and or problematizing intersectional notions of difference? It's an opportunity to not just kind of have that DEI statement out there, but to really be kind of personally invested in thinking and atoning or acknowledging how you are navigating this world. And it could be a perfect example or model for students to start thinking about how they're engaging in this world as well. I will give you an example of one. This is the one that I used, and I will tell you strategically where I use it. So yes, we are now starting to put these on websites and other documents for our students to see. But I started writing my positionality statement because I was putting together something very important. Anyone want to take a guess of why I felt I needed to put a positionality statement into something? I know that was pretty vague, but something really important that faculty have to like submit.
Your tenure portfolio?
My tenure portfolio, yeah. I thought it was really important that when I was looking at my accomplishments and the journey that I had, that I needed to say that I did all this in the package that I'm in. And I wanted them to read that and see that. Because we talk all about like the bias trainings and all of these things, but I think that a lot of times the trainings don't do enough. And so I felt it was important for myself to own the experience and the ways in which I've had to navigate not just the space at Elon where I'm at, but all the spaces that have led up to it. If we think about going back to that presentation last night and talking about understanding how long and how interwoven the inequities of education are, this was an opportunity for me to own that moment, to reclaim my space. And so I look at positionality statements, not just as a like, here I am as an ally, or here's a list of my identities, but I also look at positionality statements as an opportunity to reclaim space that perhaps was historically denied to you at certain times or not given to you in the same way. So again, I give you an example if you're interested in kind of working through these prompts and coming up with a positionality statement. I encourage it, just even for your own purpose of just having a moment to sit and reflect kind of where you are, who you are in the spaces, and how others might be seeing you in that space as well. So I want to just let us take about 2 minutes just to kind of absorb all that has been said and get a little break. People may need to use facilities. So if you want to turn your camera off, get a drink of water, whatever you need to do to refresh. And let's just take a quick kind of 2 minutes, and then we will come back and we will shift into what we've been leaning towards, which is a discussion about what is bias.
Thanks, Buffy, for the break. I needed a water refill.
Just got mine. All right. My middle schooler is delaying what they need to do next by lingering around. All right. Well, as you come back, we're going to shift into microaggressions. And this is really just an overview of bias. I think a lot of people throw the terminology around. They throw the wording around of bias, but I think many people haven't really taken that time to really sit and reflect and think about the ways in which bias might be playing out, or how the understanding around what is bias. And then thinking about, well, where could we possibly be seeing it, overlooking it in our own institutions and in our own ways in which we engage with other people. So again, I'm a child of the 80s. But I thought this was a perfect example of just kind of these assumptions. If you know the Weird Science movie, it's this idea that these two guys decide that they want to make a girlfriend, a perfect woman. And so they plug in all their assumptions around what a perfect woman is, and then out pops Kelly LeBrock, right? And the rest of the adventures ensue. But I think about this in terms of the ways in which we make assumptions or we have expectations around who are these students that we should be interacting with, what should they be showing us in terms of their readiness to interact with us. We have assumptions around perhaps, and nobody in my class or nobody that I'm engaging with would ever engage in this microaggressive behavior. But yet you have students like my student I talked about last night, who talked about the fact that every time they got into a small group discussion, they were experiencing some form of microaggression. Now, I could imagine another professor saying, no, I'm sure that those students weren't doing that to you. Again, because we are basing this off of these assumptions that we have around kind of who's a good student, who's not, what's an indicator that they are going to be a challenging student. And I think it just is an opportunity for us to really sit and think about and learn about, and a little bit more time, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about kind of implicit bias, stereotypes, and microaggressions, right? So here are some quick little examples that I put on. My favorite is the one in the middle. I don't know if anybody remembers the movie Hidden Fences. They shouldn't, because it didn't exist. There was the movie Hidden Figures, and there was the movie Fences. Both were nominated for a Best Picture. And after the nominations came out, this interesting pattern started to happen where reporters were reporting on this movie Hidden Fences, right? Because I think they were so used to this idea that there would only be one movie centering the experience of people of color actually nominated for an Oscar. The idea that there were two was too many. And so they just inadvertently started merging them together. And because the internet is a magical and scary place all at the same time, someone decided that they were going to go ahead and create a movie poster for this now new movie called Hidden Fences. And I see it, and it just absolutely makes me smile all the time. One of the things that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about what is bias, what is stereotypes, what are microaggressions, is that it all falls under the camp of social cognition. And we need to recognize that in many ways we are hardwired to look for heuristics, these mental shortcuts, to be able to make decisions in a quick amount of time with the least amount of information, to not be overwhelmed with all of the sensory inputs that are coming at us. And so we tend to group things in categories and stereotypes. We use kind of specific data to guide our expectations. And in some ways that can assist in survival, right? If you are seeing something that you like, an animal that you've never seen before crossing your path, hopefully the stereotype or the warning of danger comes into play. And instead of trying to like maybe go, pet it, you slowly back away, or you stay still hoping that it's going to pass you by. So stereotypes can be a form of survival, but these social stereotypes are what really start getting us into trouble, because we start to engage in attitudes around and stereotypes